Hello, my name is David Hopewell. I work for Gwynedd Archaeological Trust. This is the first of a short series of informal lectures about recent work by the Trust. Our first few are going to be about the work we've done to do with Roman Gwynedd. The first one will be an introduction, just to give us a timeline and get an idea of what we're talking about. If you want to find out more about Gwynedd Archaeological Trust, you can look at our website, which is at www.heneb.co.uk. Right, so the Romans in Wales, the Romans in Gwynedd. Before the Romans got here, the inhabitants were living in roundhouse settlements. We had hill forts. And there was a tribal groupings. We don't really know where the boundaries of the tribes were. We know the names of some of them. So we had the Order Vices, which tended to be in the southern part, probably, and certainly in the west. The Decangli, who were in the north-east of Wales, and the Gangani, who we don't know much about, but possibly have links to Ireland, which were on the Llyn Peninsula. These tribal names are mentioned by the Romans quite often, so it's important to remember them, but we don't really know where the boundaries of these tribes' territories were. Prior to the Roman conquests, the Romans were definitely not unheard of. There was a lead anchor stock found in the sea near Aberdaron, which at the end of the Llyn Peninsula. Could be from anywhere from the 2nd century BC to the early part of the 1st century AD. This was pre-conquest, so it shows that there was exploration and trade reaching even the remote parts of North Wales. Right, the conquests themselves. I could spend a lot of time talking about this. This is just going to be a quick run through. The first conquests to Britain were by Julius Caesar in 55 and 54 BC. This wasn't something that really lasted, and Tacitus, a Roman writer, wrote that it must be said that Caesar revealed rather than bequeathed Britain to Rome. So before Caesar had visited, Britain was a kind of mysterious place. People didn't really know much about it. It was perhaps seen as magical. It was, an El Dorado or something. Caesar actually got to see the place. Some things he said were the number of the people is countless and their buildings are exceedingly numerous, and in the most part they're like the Gauls, which is sensible, them just being across the channel. He said all the Britons dye themselves with woad, which occasions a bluish colour, and therefore they are more terrible in battle. They wear their hair long and have every part of their body shaved apart from their head and their upper lip. 10 and even 12 have wives common to them. He was also very impressed with the chariots of the British armies. He noted that the institution of Druidism is thought to have originated in Britain and to have been thenceforth introduced into Gaul. And even now, those who wish to become more accurately acquainted with it generally go to Britain for the sake of learning it. The real invasion was quite a gradual process, but beginning in AD 43 under the Emperor Claudius, and was sort of largely completed by the end of the AD 80s. Wales was actually affected quite early on. AD 47 to 48 were the first moves against the Decangli in north East Wales. They didn't actually go all that well. There was quite a lot going on, quite a lot of moves against different tribes. It wasn't really until AD 60 and 61 and under the new governor Suetonius Paulinus that we actually started seeing things happening in North Wales. He made his way through Wales, culminating on the famous attack on Anglesey that was written about by Tacitus. I will read it out to you because it's quite instructive. Suetonius Paulinus prepared to attack the island of Mona, which had a considerable population of its own, while serving as a haven for refugees. In view of the shallow and variable channel, the Menai Strait, he constructed a flotilla of boats with flat bottoms. By this method, the infantry crossed. The cavalry who followed did so by fording, or in deeper water by swimming at the side of their horses. On the beach stood the adverse array, a serried mass of arms and men, with women flitting between the ranks. In the style of the Furies, in robes of deathly black and with dishevelled hair, they brandished their torches, while a circle of druids, lifting their hands to heaven and showering curses, struck the troops with such an awe at the extraordinary spectacle that, as though their limbs were paralysed, they exposed their bodies to wounds without an attempt at movement. Then, reassured by their general and inciting each other never to flinch before a band of females and fanatics, they charged behind the standards, cut down all who met them, and enveloped the enemy in his own flames. The next step was to install a garrison amongst the conquered population and to demolish the groves consecrated to their savage cults, for they considered it a pious duty to slake the altars with captive blood and to consult their deities by means of human entrails. While he was thus occupied, the sudden revolt of the province, this is Boudica and the Iceni, was announced to Suetonius, and he left. You can see here a map of the known archaeology from that campaign. Absolutely nothing. All we know is from Tacitus's writings. If it wasn't for Tacitus, we wouldn't have known about this invasion. We wouldn't be seeing Anglesey as being the centre of Druidism. He's got a lot to answer for. It's interesting that that is pretty much the only information we have about that, and we're very much going by what he says. And how reliable is his narration? We don't really know. It sounds like it is based in fact, but some of the things about the Druids and the Furies and all that kind of stuff might just be propaganda. Well, things moved on. After that, the Romans didn't come back for quite some time. Under the Flavian emperors, moves began into Wales again, and most notably under Agricola from 77 to 78. He put down a serious rebellion of the Ordovices and almost wiped out the fighting force of the tribe, so it's said. And then he decided to take on the island of Mona again. He had no fleet, but decided to go with a rather sudden attack, and he had some auxiliaries who could swim across the Menai Strait with their arms and horses. And as Tacitus says, he delivered so unexpected an attack that the astonished enemy, who were looking for a fleet, a naval armament, and an assault by the sea, thought to such assailants nothing could be formidable or invincible. And so, peace having been sued for, and the island given up, Agricola became great and famous. Now, it should be noted that Tacitus maybe wasn't the most unbiased narrator. He was married to Agricola's daughter, so interesting. You might not see him as being the most unbiased narrator, but there we go. So we're moving into the occupation and the proper. Now, I think that probably the first thing to be built in Gwynedd was a major fort at Llanfor. Now, this was a fort built out of wood, a large fort meant to house a lot of men, and with the stores compound, and it looks like this was probably the base from which the Romans moved into the rest of northwest Wales. As you can see from the slide, the fort was absolutely crammed full of men, and this was probably one of the first things that was built as part of this invasion within northwest Wales. There probably were things like marching camps, so these were sort of temporary installations that were built, and there would also have been these in the previous invasion under sort of Suetonius Paulinus. I just don't think we found them yet. So this was the beginning of the invasion, and it was soon superseded by this, as you can see on the slide, this network of forts and roads that were built in the late 70s AD. They cover most of Gwynedd and indeed most of Wales. I think there are probably still quite a few gaps. Doesn't seem to be anything much on the much conquered island of Anglesey, so I think we're actually missing a fort on there, and there are a few other rather suspicious gaps. So I don't think we've necessarily got to the end of this particular set of fortifications. The slide here shows you a fairly typical example of the forts that they were building. These are called auxiliary forts, much smaller than the Llanfor, holding a smaller garrison. We'll talk about these in a later lecture. This is the one at Canovium in the Conway Valley. A smaller fort than Llanfor, and also you can see that it has what's called a vicus, a civilian settlement to the north of it. We'll be looking at these in a bit more detail in a later lecture. But this is the kind of thing that would have been appearing in the landscape at this time. So this was the start of the Roman occupation proper. We might be looking in Wales of maybe 10% of the population were Roman occupiers at some points at the beginning of this process. It was a militarised zone. There's no doubt about it. To start off with, that it was a militarised zone. The Romans were here to stay. Well, not to stay. They were here for about 300 years. And to put that in perspective, that's about, if you look at thinking of that in the equivalent of British history, that's as if they, from the perspective of now, that would have been, they would have had arrived in 1703 when Queen Anne was on the throne. But things changed. So we started off with a militarised zone. If we look at the map of Roman military Gwynedd in AD 130 to 150, this is not all that long after the invasion, we notice that most of the forts are no longer occupied. So something's changed, and we're looking at something that doesn't appear to be quite the same sort of militarised landscape. This situation carried on for a further 230 years. This is a long time. This is something that people tend to forget about. Everybody gets very wrapped up in the idea of the Druids and the fighting on Anglesey. But for 230 years, the equivalent of since the reign of George III, we were looking at something that doesn't appear to be quite such a militarised zone. Indeed, from 150 onwards, the only fort that was really being occupied was Sigontium. The rest of it, the Romans had gone. They had other priorities, so something else was going on in this period. I think the thing to look at next is one of our recent discoveries, which is a settlement at Tycochion on Anglesey, the other side of the Menai Strait from Sigontium. This was a trading settlement. This is what was going on at this point. The Romans were still in charge, but they were not fighting. We were not suffering. It doesn't appear there was any fighting going on. It appears that what was important was trade and probably getting taxes. Tycochion was a very rich settlement. We'll be looking at this one in a later lecture. It was rich, undefended, and was obviously principally for trade with Anglesey. So this was what was important at this time. Here are a couple of slides of Tycocheon. This is one of the map of the site from taken from the geophysical survey. We've got a Roman road with about 20 odd houses alongside it. These houses, very notably, are not round houses that you would normally expect in North Wales. These are big rectangular houses in the style of Roman. It's not quite a villa, but I think it's what would be called a corridor house. So, to a small extent, people were taking up Roman customs, and they were certainly trading with the Romans. This was an important part of life. But the Roman soldiers were not all over the landscape like they were in the militarized phase at the beginning. So this, as we said, this carried on for quite a long time, and towards the end of the Roman occupation of Gwynedd, things changed a little. We note that on this slide here that you can see there's a new addition at Caergybi. This is at Holyhead. So this is a small naval base. There are a couple of, you can just about see them on the map. There are a couple of watchtowers looking down over the naval base. Things were becoming a bit dicey at this point in the Roman occupation. We're looking around AD 360s through to the beginning of 370s. There's raiding coming in from Ireland and all kinds of instability across the empire. One fort came back into use to some extent at Canovium in the Conway Valley, but the main constant was again Saguntium. So once we get to the end of the 4th century, the Romans left. I'm not sure they left altogether, but they moved away, and we were left with this map, which shows what we're looking at now, really. They left us a bunch of ruins for us archaeologists to study. Well, obviously that wasn't their idea, but that's what happened. So, what we're going to do from this point onwards, I think we're going to have a go at doing a series of short lectures looking at different aspects of the work that we've looked at. The work that we've done looking at these monuments. So, perhaps 4 more short lectures. The first one was the first project that we did, which was a Roman fort environs project. We were looking at forts in the wider landscape using geophysical survey and excavation, and we're finding settlements, official inns, bathhouses, all kinds of things. Very exciting project, really moved our knowledge of Roman Wales forward. One particular site that came up in this was at Llanfor, so perhaps I'll do that one as a separate short lecture. I've already mentioned that one. We then moved on to Roman roads. We had lots of records of Roman roads in our historical environment record. Some of them were very good pieces of research, other things were not so good. So trying to sort out the difference between old roads that have been called Roman roads and actual Roman military roads. So that was quite a long-standing and useful project. And finally, I think we'll perhaps have a look at the excavations at Tycocheon. This was the Roman civilian settlement that I mentioned earlier. It was a very unexpected discovery and is a very important site. So I think perhaps we'll have a look at that next. So that's the end of this lecture. Hopefully see you for another one soon.